I hope it's working. I think it's working. Morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Let's just open with a quick word of prayer, and then I'll launch into things. Dear God, thank you for your grace this morning. Thank you for your goodness, for your protection to bring us all here. God, please use what I'm about to speak to bring us closer to you, to help us understand all the pitfalls and all the deceptions the enemy puts before us, and help us keep our eyes fixed on you, on your word, your goodness, your grace to lead us in your truth. In Jesus' name, amen. So, the last couple of weeks I talked about flat earth and just the need for pursuing truth, and how if we don't pursue truth, it can be very distracting and misleading, and we can get pulled one way or the other. Last week, then I talked about alternative medicine and how that is something that goes very much against a lot of alternative medicine, not all, but a lot of it goes against the Lord's word and against the Lord's truth, and a lot of the deceptions that the enemy uses in it. So this week, I'm going to actually jump back to almost what I started talking about the first week, a bit of a continuation. And it's more on neo-Darwinism and intelligent design. And so the question is, why this? Well, neo-Darwinism, to just kind of explain it, is a new Darwinian thought. The old Darwinian thought was that evolution pretty much controls where we are now. So, because the last billion years of evolution is where we are. And as believers, if we adhere to a 6-day creationist model, we don't believe that. Now, what's interesting is that over the last 100 years, with a lot of the scientific discoveries and scientific thoughts, a lot of scientists have actually gotten to the point where they're realizing there's too many holes in the original Darwinian idea. And so they realize, well, actually, we can't really hold to Darwinian thought the way that it is, because there's just far too many holes. So how do we fix this problem and still not have to believe in God? Because that's effectively what neo-Darwinianism is. It's the same old, but we want to make sure that God's not in the picture. And so enter the intelligent design argument. So intelligent design sounds Christian on the surface because there's a need for an intelligent designer. And we know there's an intelligent designer. But the world wants an intelligent designer without God. They want a non-biblical God to take the place of the Lord. And so with that, the idea of neo-Darwinianism is a way to answer those unanswerable questions and fill in those holes without a need for God. And that opens the door to all sorts of other things. About 100 years ago, this is probably one of my favorite quotes from a non-believer. His name was Max Planck. Max Planck was a particle physicist, brilliant physicist. He was a contemporary of Einstein, Maxwell. There was a group of physicists at that time, 4 or 5 physicists. Brilliant men. They pretty much have defined particle physics as we know it in the world today. And so that's where Einstein came up with relativity. Max Planck came up with the equations that define heat and the way that we understand energy. Maxwell came up with the equations that we understand light. So these guys they're brilliant. They're theoretical for the most part, but actually all their theoretical stuff gets used day in, day out nowadays by what we do. So it's a bright group of guys. But here's what Max Planck says, and this is it's phenomenal if you think about it. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particle of an atom to vibration and holds this most minute solar system of the atom together. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. So this is not a believer who's writing this. And right away, this is very similar to what we read in the Bible, Colossians 1:17. For in him all things were created, things in heaven, on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things are created through him and for him, and before him all things. And in him all things hold together. So we know what holds the universe together. The particle physicists from 100 years ago, most brilliant minds in the world, realized that the universe as we know it, without an external force, will just fall apart. We know that God holds the universe together. Hebrews 1:2-3. In these last days he has spoken to us in his Son, who he has appointed the heir of all things, through whom he also made the Word. And he is the radiance of his glory, the exact representation of his nature. And he upholds all things by word of his power. So we have to understand, if you take in light physics, it right away, there's an unanswerable question that through the law of entropy, everything should actually fall apart. Entropy is that systems lose energy. Anybody knows this. If you build a machine, unless you have power going into that machine is going to stop running after so long, usually not very long. In the same way, in particle physics, matter will fall apart without something supporting and keeping that matter spinning, that matter going. And so right away, there was holes in the idea of the original Darwinian thought, the model of evolution. And so these holes, people realized right away, we got to plug these holes. If you don't plug these holes, Darwinian ideas, they fall apart, and the God of the Bible must be true. But, the sad thing is, Einstein, Maxwell, Planck, who gave the quote, they were all deists. They came to the conclusion that God has to exist. But a deist does not mean a Christian. They all were very much against the God of the Bible. And so they all felt that, yes, we want to believe in God. There's no other option to believe there is a God, but not the God of Scripture. So that's the 40s and 50s. So by the 60s and 70s, things are changing. People are starting to realize that there's more than just a few holes here and there in this model. The hippie movement's coming in the 60s and 70s. People are starting to realize, or starting to become a little bit more spiritual, not necessarily in the good sense. That's really when a lot of other deceptions started to end up in modern culture. And between that spiritualism and all these holes that were everywhere, and the fact that materialism wasn't working for a lot of people, there was a lot of questioning. That's also the time when the Jesus movement happened, interestingly enough, which did bring a lot of people to the Lord. But, what's sad is that's also the time we see UFOs pop up on the scene. We see aliens pop up on the scene. Mystic interdimensional entities. So this is when people start raving about I'm talking to, let's say, I'm not, but people would be talking in the psychic world to spiritual guides and things like that. Portals to other dimensions. The idea of Sasquatch and all these cryptids, pretty much creatures that you can't account for from science. And then just a lot of occultic ideas and Gnostic ideas that just permeated the culture. And it was just an explosion at that time. During that time, there was a man, a German, Erich von Däniken, and I don't know, some of you might know that name. He's kind of a bit older, but he wrote a very popular book called Chariot of the Gods, or Chariots of the Gods. And I see a few older people nodding, so a few older people probably came across this book. And it was in this time that he released this book. And the book effectively just says that humanity has been in contact with aliens for the past millennia. And that's actually how we got to where we are, that our alien guides brought us into modern times. And, at first this was laughed at, but it was released in the 60s and 70s, and people kind of started looking at it and going, well, actually, that might not be a bad idea. That answers a lot of the unanswerable questions, because we have a lot of unanswerable questions. Evolution had too many holes at the time. It doesn't fit with physics, the models of physics anymore. There's a lot of things that people just can't explain, and so they're just confused. And it's interesting, because now fast forward about 40 years, and there's a quote from Richard Dawkins, where he says, it's possible that aliens created life. We can't be for sure, but it's also unlikely that any extraterrestrial life we encounter will be intelligent, which he went back on later and said, well, actually, they'll probably be super intelligent and will kill us. But this is Dawkins who's saying this. So this is Dawkins, effectively, who's probably one of the biggest critics of the Bible and the biggest critics of creationism, saying that, yeah, no, it's quite possible that aliens created life. So in 40 years, we went from a crackpot theory of aliens created humanity, or not created humanity, guided humanity, to the idea that, well, aliens might have guided humanity by one of the most prominent evolutionists in the world. What happened? And that's the question. That brings us to where we are now, where we're inundated with all of this, day in, day out, in media, in movies, in the news. You can watch the evening news, and you'll see reports of UAVs and drone activity every night, or something from somewhere in the world. So, how did we get here? And that's really the question. And we have to look back at intelligent design. So intelligent design is a movement that really took off about 20, 30 years ago. And it was partially an answer to the evolutionary problems that we were facing. One thing we have to keep in mind, though, is proponents of intelligent design are not creationist scientists. Intelligent design is a completely different field, and they actually make a very concentrated effort to keep intelligent design divorced from the Bible. And so this is something we have to keep in mind, is that many scientists who adhere to intelligent design are not Christians. They're believers that there's an intelligent designer, which in some ways would bring them closer to the Lord, but in some way it closes their heart because they don't want to accept the God of the Bible, similar to Max Planck and the physicists from 100 years ago. So intelligent design covers a number of points, covers 6 key points that they say evolution and the current evolutionary model does not address. The origin of the universe. They say the Big Bang really doesn't fit any of the models, and it doesn't. Fine-tuning of the universe in particle physics. And again, you look at Max Planck, he pretty much blew that one out of the water and said everything has to be supported by something else. An intelligent being behind everything needs to keep the universe together, otherwise it'll fall apart. The origin of DNA and life, it's too complex. In irreducibility complexity of molecular organisms. So even when you go past DNA to actually how the organisms are put together, and a lot of organisms are put together that if you take something away, it completely falls apart. So you can't actually build things up because they're already there. The origin of animals, and then the fourth one is the origin of humans. So this actually brings us to the point of, okay, how do we answer these questions that we can't deal with evolution? And that's where the ID, and I'm going to call them ID movement, the intelligent design movement, they have started to propose the idea that aliens seeded the earth. So they took about what von Duycken wrote back in '68, and he said aliens guided humanity, but he still clung to the evolutionary model. They took it a step further, and they said, well, at this point, the only way we could be here is if someone else actually came and directed evolution to, or actually even just created life from nothing, because this can't be answered by evolution. And so a lot of people in the ID movement, they now adhere to the idea that either evolution was guided or it is by direct design. And that actually addresses the last 4 problems they see, which is the origin of DNA, the irreducible complexity of life, origin of animals, and the origin of humans. Oh, now we only have to worry about particle physics and where did everything come from. So that answers 60% of the problems they have right there, if we believe in aliens and that aliens came and created us. Now, that brings us to a strange point that we're at. These arguments are gaining a lot of steam in a lot of different places. What's the proof to all of this? Because this is a great argument to make, but is there actually proof How do Christians face this? How do secularists back this up? How do they give themselves credibility? Because, like I said, 40 years ago, these were crackpot theories. How did they gain credibility to the point where people actually believe and agree that that this could actually be all plausible? So I'm going to actually start with archaeology. And, my first degree was in archaeology. I was in university. I was probably second year university at this time, and I was taking a course in Near Eastern archaeology, Middle Eastern archaeology. I had a prof who was very anti-biblical. She was very, very much against anything the Bible and very much against the Hebrews, the Jews, and made a point of trying to rip apart the Bible whenever she could. And there was a day that we were studying ancient temple structures, and she was going over ancient temple structures, and she said, well, the Bible says the Holy of Holies, that the Hebrews built the temple, but if we look back at some of the older temples in the Near East, they also have this holy place, which really means the Jews stole the idea from someone else. And so I remember going home that day, and I remember saying, well, I'm going to pray about this. And I said, God, how do I reconcile these arguments that I'm coming across in school with what I read? And I wasn't confused. I was going to hold to the faith, but I was just, okay, well, I'm used to evolution. I'm used to getting hit with the evolutionary ideas. I'm not necessarily used to getting hit with these ideas. And so I was praying, and that night I read Hebrews chapter 8, verse 4 to 6. Now, if he were on the earth, he would not be priest at all, since there are those who offer gifts according to the law, who serve a copy and a shadow of heavenly things, just as Moses was warned by God when he was about to erect the tabernacle. For, see, he says, you make all things by the pattern which was shown to you on the mountain. 2 Corinthians 4:4 says, by blinding the minds of men to the true gospel, Satan has set himself up as a counterfeit of the Creator God. So that passage in Hebrews actually hit me like a brick, like a bag of bricks. It was, it opened my mind as I have never seen things before, because it showed me that a lot of what we see in ancient human history is either, well, Moses was given the design from heaven, but a lot of what we see in other ancient cultures is just a copy. The Bible says that Satan has set himself up as a counterfeit. Satan has seen the heavenly realms. He knows what's going on. He is counterfeiting what the Lord has done. He's always been counterfeiting. And so when you look around, it really kind of helped me to understand the similarities between so many of the ancient cultures in the world and how they're so similar. How much, at this point I came to the understanding that, of course, it would make sense that some of the Middle Eastern temple structures would be similar to the Israeli, even if they were previous, if they were empowered by the enemy, if it was a spiritual knowledge that was given to these cultures by the enemy. It would make so much sense. And then if you apply that throughout the world, it starts to make sense why we see so many of the same structures everywhere. Irrespective of culture. You could go to China, you could go to Mexico and find actually a lot of the similarities. And so you see this and you go, oh, well, okay, now taken from that viewpoint, taken from a biblical viewpoint, you see that the enemy is deluding, he's misleading people on a global basis, and that it's very similar to a biblical basis. So this actually really gave me a lot of strength in university to actually understand things, but also to stand against a lot of the garbage that was thrown at the time, and there was a lot of interesting arguments. So, sorry, I got going, and then I'm trying to bring myself back. A lot of archaeologists, unfortunately, they end up pursuing the cultures they end up studying. So they end up looking at these cultures, and these cultures are often steeped in paganism, and that brings a lot of archaeologists into paganism. But if we address this, or we come at it from a Christian viewpoint, it should bring us closer to the Lord. It should show us a lot of things that are amazing, that are staggering in some places, because you can see how it's a corruption of the heavenly realm, but you can see how God's perfect design, perfect plan in his nation Israel is carried out. And it also, you bring it through to the completion of Christ's coming. You see a lot of things so differently, just in a different way, a richer way. So how did all these civilizations get there? And, I kind of just alluded to this in that the enemy hasn't changed his game plan. He's used the same game plan around the world to delude the nations. And he's done this since time immemorial. And, I listed a couple civilizations and where they got their knowledge, or if you look at their myths, their stories of where they say they got their knowledge. Rome was founded from Romulus. Romulus was supposed to be a demigod. The Romans believed they were descended from a demigod and that they got their knowledge from a demigod. The Greeks believed that Apollos, one of their gods, Apollos, funny enough, is also known as Apollyon and directly referenced in the Bible, came down from heaven and gave them their knowledge. That's a little worrisome. Egypt, Osiris was supposed to be their chief god. He gave them their knowledge. The Mayans believed in Cucullan, the feathered serpent. Sound familiar? The Peruvians, Viracocha, effectively the sky god came down and gave them their knowledge. The Chinese, the Jade Emperor, an eternal emperor from heaven who gave them their knowledge. There's a trend developing here. The Indians, Brahman, same idea. We even talked about this last week, how they believe that they got all their medical knowledge directly from Brahman. The North Americans, they share a cultural idea that the Great Spirit, and irrespective of almost any North American tribe, they believe that the Great Spirit really is where everything comes from. And that's actually, funny enough, I think maybe not quite the same as the others. Because interestingly enough, the North Americans believe in the Great Spirit, but they don't believe they can directly worship the Great Spirit. And that's actually interesting because it points more towards the Lord, where they realize that they're broken people. And that's why they actually ended up worshiping a lot of other spirits as opposed to directly trying to encounter God. But they still understood an idea of the heavenly realms. The European Celts, Tuath Danann. And the Tuath Danann were, and this is now the other side of the world again, Europe. They weren't actually gods per se, they were demigods that came, and they were part man, part god that gave humans all their knowledge. The Scandinavians believed in Odin and his sons. So the trend is that almost every major culture around the world, at some point or another, they believe their knowledge is directly descended from either a pantheon of gods, or from a god specifically, or from demigods sent by the gods, which is interesting. It's interesting in that we know that the enemy has worked. He continually deceives cultures. He continually deceives nations, and he has continued to do that even up to modern times. So, we look at the modern New Age movement. The modern New Age movement believes much of what these ancient civilizations did. They believe that they're contacting their spirit guides, that their spirit guides are giving them knowledge and giving them understanding. We look at even what some of the modern militaries have done. The modern militaries have invested in psychic research and things like that. So even our civilized Western world has pursued the spiritual world, which makes no sense unless it's spiritually, demonically empowered. So a lot of common elements. Now, how do we see this in the ancient records? We can see there's these verbal histories, written histories, to this day that there's these shared histories throughout all these different cultures. And we know that the enemy has used it. But how do we see it in our archaeological record? So, there's a lot of things in archaeology that we can't explain. And that's actually one of those big holes that I talked about at the beginning, where evolution doesn't fit. Particle physics didn't fit the evolutionary model. Sadly for the evolutionists, archaeology is finding more and more holes where things don't fit the evolutionary model. The evolutionary model says, here's mankind, we're a bunch of apes, and we slowly make it to the Stone Age. We start using stone tools, which, by the way, are incredibly difficult to make. I challenge anyone to make a stone tool, and they'll be at it for about the next 5 years before they figure out how. So it's not dummy science by any means. Then once you make it past stone tools, you get to the Bronze Age, and you're there for 6,000 years before you make it to the Iron Age, and so on and so forth. And then they divide things up very nicely into categories where they can say, oh, this was from here, this was from here, and they can control human history in their minds. So, the problem is the earliest human ruins. There's a huge problem here. The earliest human ruins, like the pyramids, like the ziggurats, like the ancient ruins up in the Andes, they're some of the oldest ruins, and they're really complex to the point that we can't rebuild a lot of these things. They give you nice diagrams, nice things, but we can't rebuild them. So let's start with the pyramids. Pyramids in Egypt, they're huge. They're 450 feet tall. They're taller than any man-made structure. They're massive. The idea from secular science is that we used a bunch of pulleys and ramps, and they say now, we used a water level to figure out if the pyramid was level, and then dragged these massive stones, the lightest of which is maybe 3 tons, with a crew of men up 500 feet, taller than any other man-made structure. And, there might be a skyscraper taller, but definitely taller than almost any other man-made structure, and put this thing together with slave labor 6,000 years ago. It's got perfect alignment with the north. It's perfectly aligned with Orion's belt. The mathematical ratio is the circumference of the earth. There are so many things about the Great Pyramid that are completely unexplainable, but there's a bunch of Stone Age dudes with sleds and stone tools that put this thing together, which, by the way, they didn't have iron yet at the time. So I have no idea how they would have cut these stones to begin with. It defies explanation. And I'm not saying this is an argument for the aliens, but I'm just saying, this goes against conventional science. And they have come up with multiple ideas to try and solve these problems, but the problems remain. We can't even rebuild them with our current technology. Baalbek, Lebanon. People might have heard this place. There's a few massive stones bigger than anything else we have seen anywhere. The stones are up to 15,000 tons in weight. There is no mechanical device anywhere in the world that can lift or move these stones. We have got nothing that can move this. And we're to believe that people came up with this 6,000, 7,000 years ago, that they chiseled out these stones that are so tremendously big, they dwarf anything. We can't move them. We can probably chisel one of these things out, but we're never going to move it. We're going to go to Mexico City. Sorry, not Mexico City. Teotihuacan in Mexico. So it's one of the most famous Mayan cities. It's got the Great Pyramid of Chichen Itza. Massive pyramid. It's actually bigger than, believe it or not, the Great Pyramid. So it's got more volume than the Great Pyramid does. Not as tall, but it's got a larger volume. Again, how do you expect a bunch of people to move this dirt around? It defies explanation. It really does. Bolivia, 12,500 feet above the sea level, is a ruin called Puma Punka. So the stones from these ruins are about 150 to 200 tons in size. They are incredibly hard. Really, all that's left is the foundation. So what was on top is now gone. It's the foundation stones that are left. The stone itself is so hard that you can only cut it with hardened steel. We know the ruin is thousands of years old. Hardened steel is a relatively recent invention. Steel itself is only in the hundreds of years old. Hardened steel is probably only 100 years old, maybe 150 if you want to look at the really early steel. So there's no way we could ever cut these stones, or the ancient people could cut these stones, or at least with our or with what we said they had for technology. Doesn't make sense. Sacsayhuaman, Peru, again, another megalithic ruin. The stones are 360 tons. They're fitted so tightly together, you can't fit a piece of paper between the stones. And to top it off, the stones have been moved 35 kilometers away from another site in the Andes. How are you going to move stones in the Andes? 350 tons in the Andes. You just can't. The Nazca lines. The Nazca lines, they're effectively pictographs, big pictures in the Atacama Desert, Peru and Chile. So these things are huge. Some of them are 50, 60 kilometers in breadth. Have you ever tried to draw a straight line for 60 kilometers while standing on the ground? It's impossible. You can't do it. There are some archaeologists who tried to prove this, and they were able to make some smaller lines, but nothing to the scope of the larger Nazca lines. So, this is an argument that some people have made for alien landing strips, because it's so far off. There's no other way you could actually account for these things. By the way, the Nazca lines are proof for a spherical Earth, because you would not be able to draw these if you did not take the sphere of the Earth into account. But beyond that, the Nazca lines show that these people needed to have some type of flight or some type of advanced geometry or surveying, because there's just no way to build them otherwise. So these things are in the news day in, day out. No, I shouldn't say day in, day out, but you come across these things, and people just kind of say, oh yeah, the pyramids, big deal. The Nazca lines, oh yeah, big deal. I went down to Peru to see the Nazca lines. But we don't really understand how complex some of these ancient ruins are. Now, I'm going to go back for a second, and I'm going to say, or bring up the point again, these are old. These are 6,000 years old. Well, not 6, probably closer to 4. These are about as old as human history is. It doesn't get older than this. So the model of the caveman to the Bronze Age, to the Iron Age, to where we are now, it doesn't fit with what we find in the archaeological record, which is why enter the new ideas. So, the secularists, they would say that a lot of these are because they're hoaxes. So that's often the first thing that people try and say. It's a hoax. Well, you can't really say the pyramids are a hoax, so unfortunately that usually kind of stops the conversation. Then they say, oh, well, there isn't technology. We don't understand their technology fully, which is probably actually a lot closer to the truth, but they don't really want to go down that road too far, so they just say, oh, they must have used something else, like a different sled with different wood to build it, because you don't want to give too much thought. And then the third idea, as I mentioned, is now the idea that we have to start looking at our outside influences, which is where the alien narrative has really started to come in. So the other thing that has really thrown a lot of people for a bit of a loop in the world of archaeology is ancient artifacts, out-of-place artifacts. And so they're called ooparts. And there's lots and lots of different ooparts. Out-of-place artifacts are things that don't make sense in our understanding of archaeology, and there's a lot of them. A couple really well-known ones are the Antikythera mechanism. So this is a computer. It's dated to about, it was found in 1900 AD. It's dated to just before the time of Christ, 2,000-year-old analog computer with differential gears that was found in a shipwreck on the bottom of the Mediterranean. For a long time, it sat in a museum. People knew it was important, but they didn't really understand what it was, till we actually had the engineering knowledge in the 50s and 60s to go, hey, wait a second, that's an advanced computer system. They've now rebuilt it, and they actually don't even really, to this day, still understand it. So they know that it has the meteoric cycle, which is a 19-year cycle for the phases of the moon, and the Saros cycle. The Saros cycle is a lunar eclipse cycle. It's part of a cycle where a lunar eclipse repeats itself every 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. So a full cycle lasts 1,262 years. So this is a long cycle. Plus, what we think is missing is a planetary cycle. So we think there was a planetary cycle on this and potentially a solar cycle on this. So very, very complex machine. Why would this have been so interesting? And so if you take a look at it from a secularist viewpoint, they say, oh, it's because they were worshiping the sun and the moon and the stars, the starry host, which they probably were. Or possibly not, because we understand now that these cycles, especially the Saros and the lunar cycle, create what are called earth tides. And so when an earth tide happens, when things start to align between the planets or between the moon, you end up with massive gravitational forces on the earth. And so you end up with major tides, you end up with earthquakes and a lot of other things. And that's been proven. When things align, it creates these earth tides. So, if you take a look at Saros cycles, they often align with earthquakes. And so these were major things for them to plot out, because, well, if you're not plotting them out, you could end up on the high seas when something major is about to happen. This is 2,000 years ago. I thought they were just learning how to work iron at that time, if I remember correct. So this is a big hole. This is a big problem for archaeology, because this is advanced technology. You have to have an advanced knowledge of the heavens and how everything is working in the solar system. You have to have an advanced knowledge of mechanics, which we didn't really have till the 50s and 60s to even rebuild this gearing mechanism. This is so far ahead of its time, or so far ahead of the conventional model, it blows the mind. The other thing that, I have lots of examples, but for sake of brevity, I'm going to try and keep it short. The other thing was, one of the other interesting finds was the Piri-Reis map. So the Piri-Reis map, I'm guessing a few of you have heard of this. It's a map that was made by a Turkish admiral, Piri-Reis. Now, Piri-Reis actually, he made this map in 1513. And this map is actually based on a collection of even older maps. The Piri-Reis map, 1513, this is just after the time that Columbus discovered the New World. It has a lot of interesting features. One, it's based on an accurate use of longitude and latitude, which, by the way, hadn't been invented yet for another 50 years. But it was based on a system that was not even supposed to exist. It shows the accurate coastlines of the Americas, which hadn't been mapped out yet because, well, Columbus had just made it to the Americas. They hadn't even made it really any further than the Caribbean. It shows the outline of Antarctica. Antarctica has been covered by ice for 4,000 years. We still don't really understand the outline of Antarctica, and it's on a map. There's so many things here. It shows the tropics of Cancer, the longitude of Alexandria as the center of the Earth, the geographical center of the Earth. A lot of things that we now put in our map systems were already in this map system from the 1500s, or early 1500s, which was based on older maps. So the question is, where did this come from? In the world of cartography, it's one of those things that they try and shuffle away because it's just, it opens up way too many questions, and it shows that in the past, the distant past of some point, we knew a lot more than what we even knew then, and we're just learning some of it again now. Actually, we know most of it now. We know some of the Antarctic coastline because of radar sats, but the rest of it, we're still learning. We know there's a lot of volcanoes. They've been in the news lately, but there's so many things that are still foreign to us. So this is yet another out-of-place artifact that just, it shows that our understanding of history isn't what we think it is. Prehistoric flight. There are so many examples of prehistoric flight. The Saqqara bird in Egypt, which they thought was a bird found in the early 1900s, but you look at it, it's got the perfect proportions to a glider. And they've rebuilt models of it. It actually glides better than most of our modern aircraft because it has better aerodynamics. There's a lot of Chinese mythology which reference flight and actually even building specific aircraft to fly. pre-Columbian plains. In the Incas, there's a lot of little models that people said were birds, but they've got delta wings. They've got the wings of delta aircraft. And if anybody knows anything about flight, you don't put a delta wing on a bird because you can only use a delta wing the faster your aircraft goes. A delta wing doesn't work because the lift is too far back in the wing, right? Like a delta wing is effectively a triangle. When you have a wing, the lift is always at the front of the wing, unless you start going fast. As you go fast, the lift, which makes the wing go up, moves further and further back from the wing. So the only way you can actually get lift on a delta wing is if your vehicle, your aircraft, is moving really fast. Which all of a sudden opens two problems. One, you've got a model with a delta wing, which means you had a fast-moving, flying something. It can't be a bird. And secondly, how did you even get that thing moving fast? So now you've got a couple different technological problems to solve, which really leaves people in a bit of a, I don't know how we answer that. So, all these different out-of-place artifacts, and, you can always bug me later. There's so many others. It goes on and on and on. It's what you would expect from a biblical view, but not from a modern, not from a secular view. So how do we answer these questions in light of Scripture? And I'm going to go to Genesis 4, verse 17 to 22. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm actually just going to summarize really quick. Genesis 4, 17 to 22 is the genealogy of Cain, the son of Adam. So the genealogy of Cain is Cain, Enoch, Ered, Mehulajel, Methusiel, Lamech, and then Lamech had three sons, Jabal, Tubal-Cain, and I think I lost the third one. He had three sons. I'll find the third name in a second. But the point I'm trying to make, it's about 7 generations from Adam to those three sons of Lamech. Let's say you have about 50 years between the generations, or 50 years before someone has kids. That's about 300 years from Adam to these three sons. Now, what's really interesting is these three sons are listed in the Bible. So the Bible is saying this is important. It's saying that this is something we have to look at. These three boys, the first one comes up with animal husbandry. Animal husbandry is not simple. Understanding, and I'm sure anyone who's taking care of animals, I have not, but I've been told that animal husbandry really takes quite a lot of understanding and knowledge. The first one is credited with animal husbandry. The second one is credited with music of the flute and lyre. And the third one, Tubal-Cain, is credited with bronze and iron working. So 300 years after creation, there's animal husbandry on the earth, there is music, there's bronze and iron. So that means an advanced knowledge of metallurgy. That's what the Bible is telling us. So secular scientists says animal husbandry started about 12,000 years ago. Then 11,500 years, let's say 8,000 years later, we have bronze, iron, or bronze working. So, 8,000 years after animal husbandry, we finally get to bronze. About 3,500 years after that, 1,500 years after that, we get music. And modern music is actually, the credit is given to Pythagoras, a Greek mathematician, 500 BC. So it took us another 1,500 years to come up with music. And then ironworking is probably from about 2,000 to 3,000 years, so another 1,000 years for us to get to ironworking. So, the secular history says about 10,000 years to get from animal husbandry to ironworking, versus the Bible, which says 300 years from the start of creation to all these things were in place. It's a complete different view than what secular science gives us. So the Bible, it shows that we were a lot more intelligent, and we were able to understand things, that we understood science. We were able to make things. You look at Genesis chapter 5. Now we're going to look at the genealogy of Adam. And the reason I'm looking at this is the length of their lives. Adam, 930 years. Keep in mind, only 300 years into Adam's life, there's metallurgy, there's animal husbandry, there's music. He's still got another 630 years to live, probably. And there's already all of this in place. Seth, 912 years. Enosh, 905 years. Kenan, 910 years. Mahalalel, 895. Jared, 962. Enoch, 365. God took him home. Methuselah, 969. Lamech, 777. Noah, 950. So the lifespan of people back then was close to 1,000 years. Close to 1,000 years without any genetic defects that we all carry nowadays. Much stronger, much smarter. As we can see, they came up with ironworking by 300 years in. And, you know, I have to say this with a caveat that some of the oldest bronzes in the world, we actually don't know the chemical formulas to them, and we can't replicate some of the alloys, the ancient alloys, which are still better than the alloys that we make. So, you know, it goes to show that we're still not where they were. So there's these vast timelines or these vast lifespans with smarter, stronger, fitter people. I think it speaks for itself. Genesis chapter 6 talks about the ark construction. So I'm just going to quickly talk about this. The ark was constructed in 100 years, which seems like a long time. Big structure, though, 450 feet by 45 feet by 75 feet. So it's a massive structure. It only took 4 men to build this. Plus, you know, I think they still had to feed their families. They still had to gather food, because the Bible says they had to gather food for all the animals on top of building this ark. And they had to live. And so, you know, I challenge any 4 guys here to go build an ark while trying to provide for their families. I think it would take more than 100 years unless you have some, and that's with our modern technology. So I challenge any 4 guys to go pick up a handsaw and build an ark in their backyard. We'll see how long it takes. Unless you have some technology or knowledge that transcends what we know that they had. Genesis chapter 10, verse 25. So chapter 10, verse 25 talks about Peleg. Peleg was one of the great-grandsons of Noah. And what's interesting is that the Bible says in his time the earth was divided. So some people say that the earth was divided geographically. Some say that it was divided by an earthquake. Different people say different things. But we also know that the Bible talks about the Lord coming down to Babel and dividing the earth, dividing the peoples. And so there's a good argument to be made that this dividing in Peleg's time was the time that God came and just divided the peoples. So Peleg lived about 100 to 150 years after the flood, which gives us a time for the Tower of Babel. Puts the Tower of Babel to probably about 150 years after the flood, which is about 4,300 years ago, thereabouts. And we have an idea where it is. There's a big ziggurat in the ruins of Ur. It's a huge ziggurat. It's not quite as big as the Great Pyramid, but we also know it's a rebuilt structure, that it was rebuilt by King Nabonidus. He was actually the son of Nebuchadnezzar. And he rebuilt it, and it's actually part of a much older structure, which was probably larger and much more extensive, but had fallen apart over the years. We know that the ancient foundation is actually in much better condition and much more built much better than even the new stuff on top of it. And so we know that the 150 years after the flood, they built monumental architecture, the size and scope, which is, well, the ziggurat is, it's about 200 by 150 by, we don't know how tall. It's 100 feet now, but it could have been much, much taller in the past. So a massive structure by any stretch of the imagination, built right after the flood. So where am I going with all of this? Why am I getting there? I am getting there because the secular viewpoint, the traditional secular viewpoint, has man developing slowly. The Christian viewpoint has man, God creating man, and man develops very, very quick before the flood, where everything comes crashing down. And slowly man has kind of recovered after the flood. But after the flood, things were probably very different. We don't know what the world before the flood was like, but the few hints we get in the Bible shows that man was very advanced very quickly. which would answer a lot of the technological problems, things that we see which evolution can't answer. Problem is that evolution doesn't like this, or I should say secularists don't like this, because they don't want to believe in the God of the Bible. They're deists because they realize they have no other choice. They have to believe in something. Too many holes in evolution. And so at this point, a lot of people have turned to aliens. And, we look at this and they say, well, we have to come from somewhere. We can't fill these holes in anymore. And so if you look at a lot of ancient cultures, the argument that people make is that the gods came and gave people knowledge in the past. And so they look at the same arguments that I presented to you as believers and said, the arguments that the enemy came to delude the people, they look at it and they say, yes, the aliens, the gods came in the past, and they're here to give us more knowledge. They'll look at the exact same things. But, if we as believers look at who these gods are, I think it should give us warning. It should give us hesitation. So a lot of these gods, they have a lot of the same characteristics, a lot of the same personalities. And, we can, and people have done this, they've done a lot of comparative studies in archaeology. And they say the god Baal is the same as Marduk in Babylon, is the same as Zeus, is the same as Odin. And it's interesting, world around, you end up usually with a chief god with a lot of the same characteristics, which gives a lot of credence to the idea that the enemy has been using the same deception over and over. We see a lot of the same common spiritual themes, how the gods demand worship. So, the Greeks worshiped their god in much the same way that the Chinese did, in much the same way that the Scandinavians did. There's a lot of very similar themes. Sacrifice. Well, it's a sad thing, but, the idea of human sacrifice was very prevalent in almost every ancient culture. Some cultures, like the Mayans or the Peruvians, the ancient, not the Peruvians, the Moques in Peru, took it to a totally different level, which was horrendous. But we're not too far off with abortion and taking it there as well. And so the enemy often he requires the same thing, generation and civilization over and over. How they contacted the gods, and this is something that we deal with here. I shouldn't say we deal with it, but the New Age ideas are kind of prevalent again. Shamanism, a direct contact with the gods. And now I'm mentioning shamanism because it's the idea of using drugs to open the mind. And we all know what's so prevalent in our society nowadays. It's the use of drugs everywhere. This was prevalent in the ancient world, but it was prevalent in the ancient world so they could open their minds to the gods. And so a lot of these ideas, a lot of these thoughts, they run throughout history for the same ultimate goal, to open your mind to the enemy, so the enemy can delude and lead you in its spiritual darkness. And that often would lead to ritualistic magic and a lot of the other things that we saw the ancients promoting, which we now promote, sadly, ourselves in our culture. Do we see it? We see a lot of ancient pictographs. It's interesting. A lot of these gods are represented in the same way. Serpent iconography world around. The Chinese love the dragon. The Mayans love the dragon. The dragon is something that is being worshipped and revered around the world. Winged deities. Winged deities, they're everywhere. They're irrespective of area. They're everywhere. And so, you have to ask yourself, why did every major culture develop a lot of the similar iconography? So now the question is, how does this relate to us? We've got this big ball, this big mess we're looking at, and it is a big mess. How does this relate to us, and why is it so important nowadays? It helps us understand the past a little bit more. It helps us understand that it helps us navigate the confusion that hits us from the past, because there's so many confusing voices. But how does it relate to us now? We have to remember a lot of these practices never went away. Where the word was preached and people turned to the Lord, a lot of these practices are kind of I don't want to say pushed aside, but the word of the Lord, the salt that the Lord puts in his people, really preserves the world. But when the word is not preached, a lot of this springs up. And so you look at where the nations have followed the Lord, where the nations adhere to the Lord, you don't see a lot of these practices. You look at our past, the past Christian nations, and where they followed the Lord, you don't see these practices. But you look at the nations which have not followed the Lord, these practices are prevalent. You look at a lot of Central and South American countries, and you go out into the native, the indigenous areas. Actually, just go to the indigenous areas here, and they still practice, they still believe, they still promote a lot of these same ideas, these same thoughts. They've never gone away, but where the word of the Lord is not preached, this is what will spring up, and it's by nature, something needs to fill the spiritual void. And so where there's a spiritual void, the Lord needs to be preached. But, sadly, our civilization is by and large turning away from the Lord. And we know that 4,000 years ago, after the flood, the enemy worked overtime to delude the earth. He deluded the earth with the Tower of Babel, and every civilization that spread out on the face of the planet, by and large, swallowed a lot of these deceptions. And the nations were deceived. And we're entering a time where, we really need to preach the word of the Lord, because if we don't, the deception is there, and the enemy is using it. We see that now a lot with the idea of aliens. And we see it a lot with UFOs, which have really come into the common thought, the common realm of discussion. And I'm going to cut this short pretty quick because I'm running out of time, and I'll give us 5 minutes for questions. I could carry on for a long time, but I'm going to go and I'm going to say, what is an alien? So the Bible uses this term as a foreigner to Israel. So if you apply this concept in the secular view, you could say it's a foreigner to earth. Common view that a lot of non-believers have is that an alien is a being not from earth. So it actually follows the biblical description that it's a foreigner. Where are they coming from? Well, the secularists would say another planet, another galaxy. The latest big one that a lot of people are clinging to is another dimension, because there's too many problems navigating space-time with the speed of light. So now the big thing is, they're just other dimensional beings, not other space beings. What does the Bible say? Jude chapter 1:6 says, "The angels who did not stay within their own proper position of authority, but left their proper dwelling. He has kept those in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day." So the Bible agrees with the definition alien. It's just who is that alien that the Bible disagrees with. So the Bible doesn't say anything about aliens as we understand it. And so a lot of Christians say, well, the Bible doesn't say anything about aliens. That means God created aliens too, which is a terrible argument. There's a lot of things that the Bible doesn't say things about, and that's okay. We can easily apply the Bible to cars, airplanes, a lot of different things. But the Bible does say a lot about God's creation and what he created. Specifically, it outlines his creation again and again throughout. It says that God created the heavens and earth. It says that God created the heavenly beings, 1/3 of which fell with Satan. And it says that God created the earthly beings, Genesis 1-2. Moreover, the pinnacle of God's creation, the ultimate, final, crowning glory of God's creation is man on day 6, the final thing that God created. Right? And he closes creation and says it's very good once he creates man. Nowhere does it say anywhere in the Bible he created aliens. Nowhere does it say anywhere that there are other beings. Nowhere does it say any of this. But it does define the limits of his creation. So if we take that in light of the many deceptions that we are looking at nowadays, we have to keep in mind, what did God create? What are the limits of what he created? Not what are the limits of God, but what are the limits of what he created? Of the angels, he says, he makes his angels winds and his ministers a fire of flame, or flame of fire. And that's from Hebrews 1:7. So we know that the angels are made to be ministers. The fallen angels are deceiving, but this is actually what they were designed to be. So the trending worldview is there's a universe, a multiverse, with alien beings looking to make contact. It says aliens exist. It says aliens are not necessarily bad. So you read any modern writer, you watch any modern movie, a lot of movies, E.T., so many others, they all, show you this happy alien who is there to help you, help humanity. And they also say they're there to reach out and make contact. Or no, it's up to us to reach out and make contact with them because they are here to help us. I'm going to close really quick. There was a short story written by a sci-fi writer, Arthur C. Clarke, called Childhood's End. This was written in the 50s. And some of you might have come across this. So Arthur C. Clarke wrote this story, and it's effectively of the USSR, because it's in the 50s, and the US were about to go to war, to nuclear war. And just before they launch the missiles, this alien ship shows up and stops the missile launch. And so the alien ship, call themselves the Overlords, they watch over Earth for 50 years, but they don't reveal themselves to Earth for the first 50 years of their existence. They just altruistically help Earth enter a time of peace and prosperity, which is something we see promoted by so many movies nowadays. After 50 years, they reveal themselves, and they're effectively... They have hooves and horns, and they look like the devil in the Bible. And so, a lot of people stop the story there, but they go on to teach humanity how to connect with an overmind, a universal overmind. And so a lot of these themes from this short story, from the science fiction writer in the 50s, we see these continued over the last 50, 60 years. They're so prevalent in so much of what we see in modern culture nowadays. It hasn't gone away at all. And I'm going to finish with 1 John 4, 1-3. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see if they are from God, because many false prophets have gone into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. Every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming and now is already in the world. And so I guess my warning, my exhortation is, we live in a time of a lot of confusion, a lot of deception. This has really hit mainstream on a lot of different levels, but this is the age-old deception from thousands of years ago, and the enemy has just continued it, and it's probably ramping up again, and we're hitting it again. That's kind of where we're at. So questions? I've got probably about 2 minutes. No questions? Okay, I'll wrap it up, and then you can bug me after. Lord God, thank you for this morning and for your grace. Thank you for your protection, for your leading, that you have given us your word that we can cling to in all these days, all these many deceptions that are around us. God, help us stay level-headed. Help us stay sober-minded. Help us come to you again and again for the answers, to not get pulled away from you. And God, please guard our families, guard our children, that we would all follow you. In Jesus' name, amen.